Good afternoon. My name's Chris Paxson. I'm Dean of the School. Welcome to this event. Before I introduce the panel and tell you a little bit about what we're going to do, I thought it would be a good time to acknowledge the diplomat and public servant Richard Holbrooke. He died yesterday. He spent a year at the Woodrow Wilson School. He spent a year at the Woodrow Wilson School as a mid-career student. And one thing he said that I think is relevant to the panel that we're about to have is that he once likened diplomacy to jazz. The quote is, "Negotiations are a lot like jazz. They're improvisations on a theme." And, you know, this sort of makes one wonder whether the WikiLeaks episode will have any sort of chilling effect on that sort of interplay, that improvisation in the conversations that takes place among diplomats, both within and across countries. And that's a topic that I hope the three former ambassadors who we have on our panel will address today. So let me briefly introduce them. They have very long bios, and I'm not going to pretend to do them justice. It would take too long. They're up on our website, but I've narrowed them down to just a few things, and I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who's sitting in the middle, was... she is, yeah.
Otherwise not distinguished from...
somebody else, that's right. She's a lecturer in public and international affairs, and she's also the director of the Scholars of the Nation Service Initiative, a scholarship program that encourages and supports students who aspire to careers in federal service that we do here at the school. Among her duties, she has been U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Yemen from 1997 to 2001. She was Deputy Principal Officer in Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq War, and she was Deputy Chief of Mission in Kuwait during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 through 91. Ambassador Robert Finn, and I see now that they have name tags, so I'm not going to tell you where he's sitting. He's a lecturer in public and international affairs and a research associate at the Liechtenstein Institute on self-determination, and he's also been a faculty member at Princeton in various roles with Near Eastern Studies. He was the first U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan in more than 20 years, from March 2002 until August 2003. He was the U.S. ambassador to Tajikistan from 1998 to 2001, and he's had numerous other diplomatic postings in Turkey, Pakistan, Croatia, and other places. Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer is, yes, the Daniel Abraham Professor in Middle Eastern Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School. He has been the U.S. Ambassador to Israel from 2001 to 2005, the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt from 1997 to 2001. He crafted the 1988 Peace Initiative of Secretary of State George P. Shultz, and in 1991, he served as a member of the U.S. peace team that brought about the Madrid Peace Conference. So it's a really wonderful panel. I wanted to say a few words before I turn it over to them. I mean, I hope what we're going to hear from our panelists is a focus on policy and how the WikiLeaks episode has and will continue to affect U.S. policymaking going forward. At the school, as a result of this episode, we've received questions mainly from students who are concerned about the impact of this episode on their careers. And this is really for students who aspire to careers in the State Department, who are in ROTC, or who are facing security clearances and whatever they do. And there's been some concern about whether reading WikiLeaks material can jeopardize career prospects. And that's something that we may talk a bit about on the panel as well. The Woodrow Wilson School does not have a policy of telling students what they can or can't read. It would be entirely inappropriate for us to do that. We believe very strongly in academic freedom. And, you know, any student can write and read about anything as long as they cite it properly. That's our only requirement. That said, you know, we have really good experts here at the school who can offer students advice on how they might deal with these issues, and so that students can make the best decisions possible based on really good information. So during the Q&A, and also maybe during some of the comments, that might be something that we also want to address this afternoon. So thank you. I think the order is going to be Ambassador Kurtzer, then Ambassador Finn, then Ambassador Bodine. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chris. Can everybody hear? Are we okay? No?
Barely.
No.
It's not on.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. What I want to do is introduce the subject by touching on 5 issues, some of which Chris anticipated in her opening remarks. And then my colleagues will give their own perspective and fill in additional blanks, and obviously we can take questions and hear your comments. The first is people have asked, are any of my cables out there? And I understand that 2 of them have been published now. One was a report on a conversation between then Senator Corzine and the director of the Mossad in Israel in 2005. And the other was an Embassy Tel Aviv analysis of Israeli policy vis-a-vis Iran. The issue is not whether I stand behind those cables. I do. We all stand behind all of the cables that go out over our names, even if we didn't draft them or even see them before they went out. The issue is that I thought, and my colleagues have thought, that we were conducting a private exchange of views. Our interlocutors thought that they were conducting a private exchange of views, and I thought that we were having a protected conversation with Washington. And WikiLeaks has proved that none of that is true, both for the recommendations that I sent in as ambassador, but also for the reports on conversations and the analysis that we did in the embassies in which we served. Also, in terms of numbers, so far, as of this afternoon, 1,460 WikiLeaks cables have actually been published. And that tells you, since we have heard that there are 250,000 that are somewhere in the queue, that we really haven't seen very much. Hopefully we won't. And we may not see a great deal of these cables, because much of what embassies send into Washington is routine administrative business, dealing with running an embassy, personnel matters, consular matters, that will not be of great interest to the press that's reporting. The second thing that so far we have not seen, and I'm not sure that we will see, are the juiciest cables that come out of embassies. Classification, after all, is both vertical and horizontal. It's vertical, going from the lowest level of classification up to top secret, but it's also horizontal in terms of compartments. When we classify cables in the field or in Washington, one assigns both a level of classification, confidential, limited official use, secret, whatever, but we also can largely direct the kind of distribution that a cable gets in Washington. And it appears so far that WikiLeaks has not accessed top secret nor compartmented information. And so even if a large number of these cables gets leaked, there will be a skewed version of what embassies have been doing, because they're most sensitive, most interesting, most analytically important, and the policy recommendations would go into highly classified, compartmented reports. And so if any of you does decide to read what's coming out of WikiLeaks, please bear this in mind, that you're reading only a very small portion of what the embassies themselves and the ambassadors themselves believe to be of significance in terms of classification and distribution. The third issue I want to touch upon is whether we're talking about substance or titillating material. You know, people have tended now to look at the cables that reported on Gaddafi's traveling habits and his traveling companions, and some of the biographical sketches of some of the leaders with whom we deal. The fact is that the substantive reporting that goes on at embassies day in and day out, 24/7, is of critical importance to creating a story, a narrative about the countries in which we're serving and the issues with which we're dealing for Washington decision makers to think about. In Washington, the higher up one goes in the bureaucratic hierarchy, the fewer cables one reads. In fact, one of the things that I'm sure my colleagues and I, certainly I told the people who work for me in embassies, is to understand that much of what we were writing was not going to be read by policymakers, but rather by analysts and staffers who would distill that material and put it into a form that policymakers could deal with. And so there's a premium on good, concise, short reports. Those cables, those messages in which an ambassador wanted to say something of particular importance to a Secretary of State or even to a president could be labeled as such with a certain amount of certainty that they were going to be read, but those are very few and far between. There's a quote I saw from Anatole Levin, a professor at the King's College in London, who has suggested, in his words, that WikiLeaks have become like peanuts. They're absolutely addictive, but in the end, curiously unsatisfying. I'm not sure how much we get out of them in terms of nutritious value. And in fact, of the 1,000 or so cables that have been reported, there isn't that much that is really surprising. It's surprising that our diplomats have been as honest and as forthright and as open in reporting what they have learned or what they've heard or what they think Washington should know. But it's not revelatory in the sense of things that we didn't know. And in some ways now, as a private citizen, I would share the view of those who have said that it's very satisfying to see that our government most often speaks with one voice, both publicly and privately. We're concerned about issues, and our diplomats explain to host governments that we're concerned about it, and then we report back to Washington that the concerns may be shared, even if other governments may not say publicly what they're telling us privately. So the key impression that so far we're getting from these WikiLeaks cables in terms of substance is that our diplomats are doing the job that we're paying them to do. They're not just attending cocktail parties, and they're not just holding up their drinks as they meet with other people, but they're digging hard for information, for perspectives, and analysis of what Washington needs to know to make better policy. The fourth issue, is there a legal or moral dilemma here? Chris indicated that there is a legal question with respect to whether or not we can even talk about this issue, let alone read the actual material that's been leaked. The government has taken at least an initial position that the fact that the material is in the public domain does not make it available for public viewing. The government is also clearly going to be examining whether or not to prosecute either WikiLeaks or the outlets that are publishing the material, and I'll leave the legal discussion to them. I don't see any moral issue here. This is simply wrong. It is not politically heroic. It's not the Pentagon Papers. Even the State Department, in the talking points that it sent out to some of us who have offered to speak about this issue publicly, said the following. State Department said, quote, "There have been examples in history in which official conduct has been made public in the name of exposing wrongdoings or misdeeds. This is not one of those cases. In contrast, what is being put on display in this catch of documents is the fact that American diplomats are doing the work we expect them to do. They're helping identify and prevent conflicts before they start. They are working hard every day to solve serious practical problems, to secure dangerous materials, to fight international crime, and so forth. This is the role that diplomats are playing in the service of America." The question really is, do we, the American people, have a right to have access to classified material? Now, there's a question that can be raised, certainly in the academy and elsewhere, as to whether or not governments classify too much material. That's a debate that goes on all the time in freedom of information requests and in other fora in which this issue is played out. But once the government classifies material, we do not have a right to see it. And even those who would hold that we have a right to see it cannot extend that argument to the rest of the world. We have washed our linen, not only in the public of American public opinion, but also in world public opinion. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for purposes of this afternoon, the implications and the impact on diplomacy. And I would agree with the way Chris introduced this subject. There certainly will be a chill cast on the willingness of our interlocutors to speak to us candidly and honestly about the issues on their mind. There will be a chill on the willingness of the political, economic, and other reporters in the embassy to report what they've heard as honestly and as openly as they've done until now. There will be a chill on ambassadors and others who are writing cables recommending policy for fear that this will impact on the policy process. It will also result in what's called less record traffic. The diplomatic record is going to suffer probably for some time to come by a drop-off in reporting. More reporting is going to be done by telephone, and if we played the game of telephone in this room, you would all remember how bad it is to try to convey information orally, and it's particularly bad when that information involves texture and nuance and requires some degree of understanding. And so more and more of our reporting will end up being phoned into Washington. Fewer people will actually hear what's happening on the ground in countries where we have very significant American national interests. And so our policymakers will therefore benefit less and less from the value of having 24/7 coverage on the ground. It'll likely also result in more decisions being made as a result of policymakers reading the media and blogs or acting on the basis of intuition and feeling. Now, we elect our policymakers, and we often elect them knowing that they come into office with little background in foreign affairs. In fact, if you look back since 1972, in only one case in our presidential elections has the candidate with more experience in foreign affairs been elected president of the United States. That was in 1988. And so we elect a president for a lot of reasons, perhaps believing that the system will help the president deal with complicated matters with which he has not had experience. Imagine then if that context, if that system which is supposed to provide the president with the best of what he should know before making a decision is now crippled as a result of this WikiLeaks experience. Finally, I would note the impact that this will have directly on programs that are absolutely critical to our national security. We work cooperatively with a lot of countries in the world, even those with whom we don't have very good bilateral relations. And we're seeing some of that come out in the cable traffic that WikiLeaks has produced. I'm not sure that we'll be able to continue that kind of close cooperation when, in fact, the willingness of those countries to cooperate with us has now been exposed to public scrutiny. We're talking about counterterrorism, counterproliferation, trafficking, money laundering, you name it. Our diplomats are on the front line of all of these efforts to try to assure our national security, and WikiLeaks has now stabbed all of us in the back. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, to answer the first question that Dan answered, I don't know that any of my messages specifically were in WikiLeaks, but I'm happy to report that the National Review described my reporting as brilliant. I'm not sure what they read. But one of the things that people, that somehow it doesn't seem to have come out, is the mechanics of cables and reporting and how it works. And the fact is that messages go out over the signature of the principal officer in the embassy or the State Department or whatever part of the government it is that's issuing the message, so that cables that go out from Washington typically will say that they are signed by Hillary Clinton, Secretary Hilton. If she is not in Washington, they will be signed by the deputy. In the same way, messages that go out from an embassy are signed by the ambassador, or if he is not there, the person who's in charge of the embassy. So in a lot of these WikiLeaks reporting, the person who is described as sending the message is in fact not the person who wrote the message at all, and may not even have read the message, if in some cases. Messages in embassies are written by perhaps a number of people, perhaps one person. It depends on what it does. If you think of all the information that an embassy supplies is a huge supermarket of items. Some of them obviously are of more interest than others. If you want to make a meal out of them, you have to do more with some with others. And so the information that our reporting officers take in at an embassy is of many, many different kinds. And what that means in order to to produce the product for Washington, sometimes you have to have many people working on a message. Sometimes you just have one person who writes it. A lot of the kind of titillating messages that Ambassador Kurtzer was talking about typically will be reports of interviews, one-on-one interviews with interlocutors in foreign countries, people who will probably not be available to us in the future to give us the kind of background information about the figures in the Capitol that we need to understand how it works over there in these other places. And when I was in Ankara years ago, we had Ambassador Strauss-Hupé, who was, we always described him as the last Habsburg ambassador because he was born in Vienna in 1900. And when he briefed visitors, the first thing he always said in his Viennese accent was, "Gentlemen, I want you to remember this is not Connecticut." And that is what people in embassies do. They remind Washington that it's not Connecticut. And in order to do that, we have all of these different vehicles. So when you look at the WikiLeaks and you have a name attached to a cable, it's not necessarily that person who wrote those ideas, although he is responsible, of course, for the messages that go out from his embassy, just as any executive person is responsible for what goes on in his watch wherever he is. Dan has addressed the ethical issue, and so I don't have to go into that there. The widespread reaction to WikiLeaks, the fact that many of the vehicles that were presenting WikiLeaks and that were enabling people to access WikiLeaks have declined now to do that, shows the realization of a kind of universal reaction. This is something that should not have gone on for the various reasons that Dan said. It is not something that is in our national interest. It is not something that is in our personal interest. It may be fun to read these cables. Of course, it's fun to find out what people think about leaders and how they behave properly and all that kind of stuff. That's why we have lots of popular magazines for that kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing we should be reading about our sensitive international relations because there are lots of other things that apply to that. The reactions from foreigners have varied. As we see in South Asia, the leaders there have mostly downplayed it. Apparently, the Prime Minister of Turkey was not at all happy. I read in the Turkish press lots of angry remarks by him. Apparently also the European leaders were not happy to have personal remarks made about them put out in public. So there are personal reactions, visible personal reactions, and there are lots of reactions that we're not going to see, simply that people will not talk to us, people will not be available to us, and as Dan pointed out, our own people will be much more circumspect in what they say to Washington. I can assure you, I don't want all the things I wrote 20 and 30 years ago in various posts to be in the public view. The State Department wanted me to put them out there, and I said, no, we can't do that. That's not good news. So it's something that's going to affect everyone who is in the arena of international diplomacy. Diplomats on other sides with whom he cooperated, perhaps with or without the knowledge of their governments, people in our own government, and people who are interested in diplomacy and not necessarily governmental figures who stand to be in very, very dangerous positions. I'm sure some of them will suffer physical harm because of what WikiLeaks is doing. And that leads me to a question that has been puzzling me since this started. We only have about 1,500 cables so far out of 250,000. And I'm wondering who's choosing the cables that are being put out. Why is it that there are so many cables regarding Turkey, for example, in this first tranche of messages? I don't have an answer for that. But I'm wondering what's going on here. The WikiLeaks people are basically engaging in a kind of a global blackmail, saying if you're not good to us, if you do anything to us, then we're going to put the whole thing on the table. The media, the New York Times and the other newspapers involved, are selectively shaping these messages and giving parts of them and not other parts of them. And I find the whole thing very, very disturbing. I really don't know what's going on here. There are legal consequences for the very act of obtaining these, but also the massaging and the presentation. People are creating policies and doing important things, and no one seems to be addressing an issue that I find, as I said, to be extremely disturbing. What will happen now? Dan has addressed that. We all know that it's going to be a different world. We also know, as experienced diplomats, that people will get over this, that it will come back in some way to some degree to what it was before. But I also know that people in other parts of the world that don't perhaps move as fast as we do here will have very, very long memories about this. And this will be haunting us in those countries for decades to come. So I'm going to stop there and let Ambassador Bodine take over.
I'm the one sitting in the middle. First of all, I do agree with my colleagues on their points. And I don't want to duplicate it because I know that there are a lot of you who have some very specific questions. So I'm just going to underscore a couple of brief points and then allow us to get to Q's and A's. On the 250,000 cables, my understanding is about half of them are unclassified, and they probably are the routine cables that WikiLeaks and others are going to find as boring to read as we found to write. And they are not going to have any value at all. There's apparently 15,000 of the 250,000 are classified, and these are the ones that are coming out slowly. I will say none of my cables have yet come out. I thoroughly expect them to come out. And to kind of give you an idea about how sensitive we all have become on the chilling effect that this will have, is the day after tomorrow, I was supposed to go on a trip to one of the countries in the region that I've dealt with for a very long time and have a lot of very good friends. And I got an email this morning from their ambassador in Washington telling me that the trip was off. And because of recent developments, and that's all he said. And I will say that, my initial reaction was that this whole WikiLeaks thing has already started to chill and stifle conversations. Now, I was being a little oversensitive, perhaps, because what they did is they postponed the trip until January. Either that or they've postponed it to wait to see if any of my cables come out and what I said. But this chilling effect, I think, cannot be overstated. The initial reports were all of the reports about Berlusconi's personal habits and, as I said, Gaddafi's traveling companions. Not the real issue, not the real meat of the diplomatic cables. Too much emphasis was also put on this idea that diplomacy was conversations between ambassadors and heads of state, and that these people would get over it soon enough. And I think as Dan and Bob have both pointed out, the essence of these cables, of this reporting, goes far beyond just the conversations done at the highest level. And the ones that are going to be chilled are actually the ones below that you need for the texture and the nuance and the context. It's very important to be able to convey what the U.S. policy is and to understand what the policy from the other government is in return and convey that to Washington. But what makes diplomacy important for all of us is understanding the evolution and the dynamics of the policy. How is it playing both within that government, within civil society, within the academic world, within the business community? No government, no society, no policy is driven by just one person. And so what is that dynamic? Who are the players? Where are the fault lines? Where are the strengths? Where are the allies that we can work with? Who are the people we need to be concerned about? Those conversations go on at all levels from the embassy, working with all facets of the society. And those, in many cases, are the people who are going to be burned by some of these reports. King Abdullah can handle the issue of, cutting off the head of the snake. But if we're talking to a mid-level person in a ministry, we're talking to somebody in an opposition party, we're talking to somebody in civil society, and they're talking to us about how they see their government, where they want it to go, what we might be able to do to support it, or what we are doing to actually perhaps make their lives more difficult, and that gets out. Those conversations are going to be chilled. Those people do not have the advantage of being the head of state or the head of government. My own personal, if I had to put an analogy on this, I think that this is going to be something like the Gulf oil spill. And there is going to be a lot of attention to it. There's going to be a major outpouring of it. The real damage, as with the Gulf oil spill, is going to take us years to see. And much of it we may not even understand. But it will be cataclysmic. The number of people who are going to be hurt, politically hurt. Perhaps in some governments, there's some places they may be physically hurt. But it's this lack of information, this lack of context. This is what your diplomat does for you. The other chilling, and this is, I think, an extremely important part of the problem, is those who support these leaks talk about the need for truth to power, speaking truth to power. One of the most important parts of that really is what embassies say to Washington. Their ability to speak very candidly to Washington about the limits, the opportunities, the problems of policy, and how it should be reshaped, how it should be reformulated. And if embassies cannot have that conversation to Washington about Washington, then you are going to have this drawing in of the policy-making process to where it is just a small group in Washington without any reality check. We've tried that once about 10 years ago. We did a policy that way, and it didn't work very well. On the question of the morality, the legality, I did bring, particularly for those of you who are in the government, planning to go into the government, concerned about security clearance, a very good article that was in the Washington Post that lays out what the law is concerning these documents and what the government policy is concerning reading them, and also what some of the caveats are. And I think if you're going to make an informed decision, you need to take a look at that. There are some wonderful rumors pinging around the school that if you basically say the word WikiLeaks, the government will find out. The government is watching your Gmail account and is going to personally come after you. Your government has other things to do. It has to watch all these WikiLeaks. But it is a question of, of judgment, of your ability to understand how to handle classified materials. And so I would very strongly suggest that you read this. It is, to my mind, if I had to make an analogy, because I have heard the argument, well, it's in the public domain, so why can't I just go ahead and read it? I think of it in terms of somebody has knocked over, has hijacked a Best Buy truck full of all sorts of electronic equipment. The fence is sitting there. He's selling it on the street corner. You buy it. Now, were you involved in the initial theft? No. Are you actually purveying the stolen goods? No. You have a reasonable expectation that what you're buying or what you're reading is somebody else's property. And that is at least the view of the government on these documents. And so I think you need to take that into account. I will say that I have a certain ambivalence. There is a part of me that would actually like people to read the whole cable and not be dependent on that part that the New York Times has chosen to highlight, the 5 or 6 words out of a 5-page telegram, without giving you the lead-in, without giving you the rest of the context. You're also hearing kind of one part of a conversation. You're reading one cable out of context. You don't know what led into it. You don't know what came after it. You don't know what the response was. And so in that sense, in a way, I kind of wish that people who are really interested in these issues would read the whole cable, but at the same time, there is a real legal question. As I said, I don't think we know what the long-term impact will be. But if I had to characterize what was done, I would call it cyber vandalism. It really had no point to it except to cause maximum damage. It was not policy-focused. It was not constructive. It does not rise to the level of the Pentagon Papers or even a whistleblower in an agency or Philip Morris. So I think that we have seen great harm done to us by somebody whose only goal was to harm us and not to advance policy, not to advance public good, not to advance peace in the world or anything else. We will recoup, we will survive, but this has been a very damaging and very sad time to watch. Thank you.
So apparently these are recording mics, and because we're so full, it's hard to hear our speakers. This is less than perfect, but you're all diplomats. You were in Afghanistan and Yemen, and you can. This is nothing. Right?
You have electricity and lights.
I know. So if people can't hear,
go.
great.
Bring out
This
the
is
heavy
also-
equipment.
So we can improvise. Okay.
This one's working. This one's live.
Attack us.
Keep talking about how outrageous WikiLeaks was to put all this stuff out, which is unquestionably true. But what about the PFC who could get a
Yes.
hold of all of that?
I think that's an excellent question. That is the guy who knocked over the Best Buy truck. If anybody is going to be facing, I think he is actually already in jail for having leaked the military cables. It brings up a very important question that is certainly being addressed in Washington and is another one of these chilling effects, is how did he have access to 250,000 State Department cables? He was sitting in Baghdad. We know that these cables were not all ones related to Iraq. There's a lot on China. There's some from Latin America. They're from every place. How did he have the time and the opportunity to download these? Where was where was the person in charge of the unit as he was doing this? Those are a lot of questions that definitely are being looked at. What can end up being, I think, very detrimental is that this was an overreaction to 9/11 when we were supposed to, tear down the stovepipes and allow information to flow more freely. And we kind of overdid it. But as we do the course correction on that, there is a concern that we will again start to exclude people from information they need, as opposed to come up with a much more rational, better regulated, better monitored need-to-know system. But yes, absolutely, there is a private first class who has a lot to answer for. And I think a chain of command that clearly failed in their responsibilities to supervise him and allow him to do this.
Yeah, I would just add that I've been disturbed since Ambassador Eikenberry's cables were released that no one had been arrested in that regard. Where was the chain of command there? It was flagrant, it was intentional, everybody knew about it, and no one did anything about it, and now we're faced with this much worse incident. Had they acted properly the first time, this maybe would not have happened.
There's one other aspect of this to watch. For many years, the State Department budget has been hit so badly by a Congress that paid no attention to foreign affairs that, up until the 90s, we were using Wang computers. The State Department was one of the last agencies to really enter the last century. And I fear that this is going to rebound in the wrong direction. That rather than provide state with the resources needed to upgrade a system that clearly had faults, that was reliant upon a DOD, a Department of Defense system, that clearly had faults, that people are now going to punish the IT infrastructure of the State Department and DOD and cut back. And, it could all turn even worse if we don't upgrade the capabilities to assure the protection of this material in the future.
I think there's some sort of feedback problem with the mic. Do you think you could pull the smaller one away from it?
Thank you.
Is that little crying in the background?
Yeah, that's the.
I thought that was the moral conscience of the Woodrow Wilson School.
Woodrow Wilson weeping over what has happened to diplomacy, yes.
To follow up on that a little bit, in terms of the security of the State Department, so here we have a PFC who's been allowed to dry, but what about the security of State Department in other realms. If he can do it, why can't other foreign nationals do the same thing? I mean, it
Well,
just
you-
seems
you
like the
need-
State Department is porous. in that
You know,
sense.
none of us is an IT expert here, but you need the basic access into the system. And as opposed to those working in the department, where clearances would be extended laterally only to cover material that impacted on one's job, apparently in the DoD system, once you got in, once you walked through that door, you could open up any one of the hundreds of other doors to compartments that had nothing to do with your business. So state had a problem because it wasn't able to manage its own communications and therefore had to hand over much of it to DoD. And DoD has a much more serious problem. It has no control over who's seeing what. And both systems need repair. My concern about state is that it's an orphan when it comes to the federal budget. DoD can always command a tremendous amount of attention on the Hill and can find ways to fix the problem that has now been seen, but I'm not sure that state can recover that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not sure that I would describe it as Private Manning being hung out to dry. This is a young man who very consciously, very deliberately downloaded 250,000 State Department cables plus the military cables. This was not just one board afternoon. I think I'm going to see what I can do. This was a very long-term, deliberate effort on his part. And as I said, it goes to the issue of cable access, information access within the government, and as Dan said, within DoD, not being very well controlled. So that's where I think the problem lies. But I do not consider this a hung out to dry.
So
Let's get some students, if we can. Oh, that changed the hands.
Yes, young man.
I'm kind of curious why we haven't seen the State Department think about reshuffling a lot of personnel in the aftermath of the I mean, for example, Ambassador Eikenberry in Afghanistan. It's hard for me to see how Ambassador Eikenberry can continue being our ambassador to Afghanistan after all that has come out regarding President Karzai. And yet, you know, the ambassador still remained in place. Business seems to be moving on, you know, on some level. I mean, maybe there's a chilling effect, but, you know, it's hard for personnel are still there. So why hasn't there been any sort of
Well, I think one aspect of this is that it's not the diplomats, it's not our ambassadors, it's not our embassies who did anything wrong. And I don't think state wants to begin, in a sense, punishing those who have been affected by this. The real question is going to be, will their work be affected by what happens? And I think that is the shoe that hasn't yet dropped. I heard last week, I don't know if it's true, that the German government has asked for the recall of our ambassador. It may have been just a rumor, but we may see more of that as time goes by. It was Barbara who suggested that heads of state may find it easier to get over this than bureaucracies or lower level officials. So how this plays out in the various countries where these revelations are now taking place, I think is still an unanswered question. I would doubt, though, that state would preemptively move our diplomats around as a result of this, since it's not they who created this problem.
Yes, sir.
When is it okay for a newspaper to publish classified documents, and who gets to decide when it's okay or it's not okay?
None of us are lawyers, I don't think.
I didn't hear the question.
It was, when is it all right for a newspaper to do this or not?
Never.
It's not. There was an interesting debate amongst two former Department of Justice officials on the NewsHour about a week or 10 days ago, where they at least tried to parse the difference between First Amendment protections for journalism, journalists, and something like this cyber vandalism of WikiLeaks, which had no journalistic content, no journalistic value at all. I don't know enough about the law to say if where they were drawing the line made sense, and this is something that the courts are going to have to decide. But, at base, any release of a classified document is still a violation. There did seem to be, the way they were describing it, that if a journalist such as the New York Times or the Washington Post reviews it, puts it in context, puts it, analysis, in other words, wraps it in a journalistic package, it is protected by the First Amendment. Whether or not it should be is a theological issue we can debate, but that the WikiLeaks did not even have that journalistic package to it, and therefore was, qualitatively, ethically, morally, legally different.
So if Mr. Assange was going to publish the cables anyway, then the New York Times have ignored them.
What was that? Say it
The
again.
question was, if Assange was going to publish them, could the newspapers, or should the newspapers have ignored them? It ends up being, there's a large moral issue here. Where does responsibility end? If everybody is walking into a bank vault that was open and taking money, is it okay for you to do so? Where's the responsibility to either stop a misdeed from happening, certainly reporting a misdeed, as opposed to taking advantage of it? So, if Assange did what he did, for whatever reasons he did it, does that then exculpate those down the line from responsibility for stopping? And my argument would be, and again, I'm not a lawyer, is that the New York Times, the Guardian, the Financial Times, whoever else, should have exercised responsibility. This was not a journalistic scoop. This was snooping in confidential material. And I think it'll be interesting to see how academics treat the various cases, because there are precedents. A couple of us have mentioned Pentagon Papers, classified material that was leaked for a very specific policy purpose. And one of the reasons I quoted that State Department excerpt was because even the department understands that part of our national debate about foreign policy will at times lead people to do things like leaking in order to show that the government has lied or carried out misdeeds or whatever. This is not one of those cases. And therefore, there is no suggestion that anyone along the line had an excuse to act differently than to report it, to stop it, and to prevent it from being published.
I would also say that I took issue with the New York Times editor's justification of his actions, that no, there was not going to be any great harm to any person, without fully understanding that, again, as we were saying, these conversations were not solely ambassador to head of state, even if you could somehow say that that was all right. But putting all these other people that we talk with, chilling those, and the damage it does to national security. I found the editor's statement either disingenuous or terribly naive in his, we're not really harming anybody or anything by doing this. Well, of course you are, and you know that. So I took issue with it.
What do you think has been the impact, or will be the impact, of the American reaction to the WikiLeaks on the image of the U.S.? There's been full of reports in the foreign press about the reaction that has taken place in this country, for instance, very public political calls for censorship of the press, or reports about stories like what happened at Columbia University, where students are basically asked to censor themselves. And isn't that putting oil on the fire, giving ammunition to all of those abroad who are always talking about American hypocrisy? And here they catch it in action, and then they're going to use that against the United States. So do you think the US has been harming itself with its own reaction to the WikiLeaks fiasco?
I think it's too early to tell, and I think part of the reaction thus far has been, how many fingers do you have to put into the dike, which is now clearly leaking badly and about to collapse. And I'm not sure there's a lot of long-term analysis or policy being bandied about. first thing you have to do is to stop this hose from producing another tranche of cables. There are rumors now that the banking system has been infiltrated by WikiLeaks. And in January, we're going to have thousands and thousands of cables from the banking system. Some people might be happy about that, given what happened on Wall Street and the banks last year. But I think it's too early to form the kind of judgments about the very important issues you've raised, because they go in so many different directions. We're going to have a huge debate in this country about whether or not to prosecute and the impact that that has on First Amendment rights. You're going to have an equally huge debate about, or revive a debate about, whether the government is overclassifying the material. If, in fact, stuff comes out that people yawn over and are not that impressed over, they're going to wonder why it's classified. You're going to have a debate, as you suggested, for those who now want to shut down newspapers or shut down First Amendment rights. So there's going to be a slew of ramifications here, but my guess is that we're much too early in this, and we're really doing stopgap measures at the moment.
Way in the back.
Hi. So you mentioned the lives being put in danger by these cables, and to me the first people that come to mind are the human rights and civil society activists that were providing this information to American diplomats, and could potentially, if cables that include their names come out, be under threat of physical harm. Do you think that the American government is going to try and do anything for those human rights activists or civil society activists that it's dealt extensively with to try and protect them in any way?
As Ambassador Kurtzer said, we're in the process of trying to stop a dike from collapsing. So I think the answer in principle would be yes. In fact, it might be maybe. Because of just the volume of things. You're talking about literally thousands of people around the world. And I can assure you that people in foreign capitals who read those messages will know exactly who spoke to the Americans, even if their names are not there. And so standing up for activists who may be opposed to their governments, even governments who are allies of ours, I can assure you is something that the United States has continually done and will continue to do. But in this particular case, volume may prevent us from doing what needs to be done.
Yeah, I have absolutely no idea what the answer is. I do know that the range of issues, the range of the ramifications from this are such that the State Department has established a task force, a working group, which we all know from our earlier days. We have a 24-hour operation going on, drawing on the resources throughout the department and probably the rest of the government. And much of that is trying to assess some of these questions. It's not just simply a task force to call a head of state and say, by the way, there's a cable coming out that talks about your personal habits, beware. I don't think we particularly care what we said about Berlusconi. But assessing some of these other ramifications. And I don't know for a fact that, it will include, do we have to offer any kind of protection to people who have been identified, but I do know that they are taking it that seriously, that there is now a 24-hour task force managing implications and ramifications.
Do you believe that the public has a right to know about casualties in the Middle East caused by the U.S. military that were either never exposed to public knowledge?
If you're asking about a specific case, I don't think any of us knows enough about that case. The question I raised from the podium is a large issue of where is the line drawn on classification of material. In an ongoing operation, whether it's a military operation or a counterterrorism operation, there are a large number of considerations which normally weigh in favor of classifying information because of the ongoing nature of the operation. In the Pentagon Papers case, the opposite was seen to be a public good, which was a sense that after many years of the public not being informed of what internally the government was saying about the war. The public had a need to know in order to deal with the ramifications of persistent misinformation or disinformation. And there's no clear line to be drawn here. Maybe 5 years from now, when we look back on this and we have a sense of what's out there and what was revealed and did it tell us something, we'd be in a better position to do so, number one. Number two, as Barbara and Robert suggested, since you're not going to see, it appears, all of the material that's there, you don't really know whether or not there's a clear picture that Washington's been getting from the field. It's critical that Washington understand, and then choices have to be made as to where Congress should be briefed in open session or closed session, where the press should be briefed, where the public should be briefed. But the first requirement of government is to be operating on the basis of a full deck of cards. And even if you read all of this WikiLeaks stuff so far, you don't have a full deck of cards. And that's why it's additionally hard to make that answer that question.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to get into that specific case, but I do want to underscore the point that we're seeing small pieces. It's like a huge mosaic. And, you know, you've got this piece here, and if you just look at just this one cable, you may get a very distinct impression about a fact, an event, a policy, a conversation. But if you don't have the full context of it, if you don't have the rest of it, as I said, it's like walking past somebody on their cell phone and just hearing their side of the conversation. Very easy to hear it correctly and completely misunderstand it at the same time.
Yeah, and I would just add that in our normal reporting in the State Department, there's something called the Dissent Channel, which is designed just so that Washington can get a full view. And if someone at an embassy or any kind of mission seriously disagrees with the policies that's being advocated by that missioner in the reporting, they have the right to send their own message to Washington, and people do this on a regular basis. So, what we're getting in WikiLeaks is just a very small part of a particular strand that's not in context, whereas the object of diplomatic reporting is to provide as holistic a portrait as possible for Washington. Man in the back.
New York Times was given access to Spanish and German foreign ministry cables, showing confidential Spanish or German foreign ministry showing specific U.S. publishers cooperating with those ministries of foreign affairs.
In other words, if WikiLeaks was had somebody else's diplomatic cables to the New York Times?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'd make the same pitch as I did today. I know and you know that we have a counterintelligence operation, which the Spanish government has, the German government has, and everybody has. And it's their responsibility to ferret out spies. It's not their responsibility to ferret out people who provide information or perspectives or views about what's going on in this country. So if WikiLeaks did the same thing with whoever, it's wrong, and there's no justification for it.
Sit here.
I guess my question goes back to the last presentation. I don't take this idea of how you said that it was sort of a calculated, focused attempt to address one particular policy issue, which ultimately will be a whole string of misdemeanor transgressions of laws as part of this issue. And how you thought that the WikiLeaks case is, this sort of a broad attack. And I wonder that, this is still unfolding. We've still got 1,000, only had 1,500 cases, 15,000 classified Ambassador Barbara Bodine. If in the course of this, we find out something, or if the U.S. authorities or the United States finds out a particular transgression or mistake on the part of the U.S. government, which might even be a tangential investigation building off of the cases, would you then change your position? Would you say that it was in any way justified?
I would not say it was justified, but I would hope that we would pursue whatever prosecution or response would be needed. In other words, I can't be blind to the fact that there may be misdeeds, suggested in an earlier question, or wrongdoing that emerges from this exercise. But the fact that it's terribly wrong to have done this reveals that can't be justified ex post facto. Now, I thought your question was going to be, so I'll tell you what I thought you were going to
Answer that one. Right.
Okay.
Good diplomat.
No, had the WikiLeaks revelations been only focused on one major policy issue, on Iraq or on Afghanistan, that even if they had access to 250,000 cables, WikiLeaks had said, we are so upset about what's happening in Afghanistan and we believe that the American government has been lying systematically, da-da-da-da-da, that would be an interesting debate. And I don't know if I would sit here today and tell you that I formed an answer to that question, because that's more akin to the Pentagon Papers issue. And again, I mentioned it, even the State Department recognizes that there is a public interest on that kind of an issue that may at least be arguable, even if at the end you don't agree with it. But the very fact that WikiLeaks didn't do that, they just let everything out, suggests that this is anarchism. It's not a policy-focused issue. It's an attempt to destroy a system, in this case a system of reporting, analysis, and diplomacy, rather than focus on a specific policy or set of policies.
This would happen in the Bush administration. How many for the Bush administration were back?
Same, probably.
Same.
I mean, I'm not sure how many other options there are on response. You know. Yeah, I was going to say, this is not the kind of thing that I think you can, even special forces cannot really go in and do this one. So I don't think there is a military solution to WikiLeaks.
Accepting what you've said, that this is a fence operation, aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot if, since this is going out all over the world, if we bar our best and brightest in academic institutions from poring over it? I would say, why don't we have a Woodrow Wilson School seminar that is devoted to poring over the WikiLeaks documents and determining what's in them? Otherwise, we're outsourcing it. China's going to do it.
We don't have a ban at this school on reading WikiLeaks, for one thing. This is the Columbia University did overreact. Even in the words of the State Department spokesman, Columbia overreacted. And the dean has outlined our policy, which is, we don't have that kind of a blanket ban. We leave it up to the judgment of the faculty and the students to decide what they're going to do, and what their own judgment is.
I would add that I hope that this task force that has been stood up is actually looking. I hope they're looking at this issue, because in the areas that I know, policy would actually benefit from having material that was going to be in the public domain in 25 years now come out. It's not that I would want that out, but since it's out anyway, maybe we should figure out a way to understand it better, including understanding, as Barbara noted, what's not there. The points on the canvas that are missing, and the few points that we know. But I'm not sure. I think in the order of priorities, that may be lower down on the State Department's list of allowing academics access, formal access to this material.
So a follow-up question to the question about whether if New York Times got hold of some German cable, would your answer be the same if the New York Times got hold of North Korean cables or Iranian cables? We don't think the New York Times job is, to protect the American national interest. That's the government's job. So in that case, if it's different, why would it be different? If they,
Again, I'm not going to try to draw too fine a line here. The process by which this has happened is wrong and has no justification. If it involves a specific case where there is a huge policy issue that's of public concern, it's debatable. So if there is an ongoing investigation of North Korea's nuclear program and an ongoing investigation of how that nuclear program has impacted on American national security, and whether the United States has adequately protected security through the actions it's taken vis-a-vis that program, and the New York Times then gets cables that shed some light on it, we can talk about it. I don't have an answer, but we can talk about it. Because that fits into, at least for me personally, it fits into the Pentagon Papers paradigm. Maybe it really doesn't, but for me it does. But I don't see that in any of this. If what you got was all of North Korea's reporting, including how desperate it is for food and its relations with Cuba and how it's, then it's the same kind of Best Buy or open bank vault issue that we're talking about. It's wrong.
I was wondering if perhaps in your capacities now more as professors than ambassadors, if you can reflect on sort of taking this as an assumption or taking this as a given that sort of morally it was wrong for these documents to be put out in the first place. Would you reflect though on what a reasonable government response might be, and whether there might be a role for academia to push back in some respect? And I think, and perhaps providing some clarification to the extent that you have it on what the State Department position is would be helpful. We know that as students that someone from State Department, a State Department official, reaches out to Columbia University and says, sort of tells students not to read this stuff.
That was not accurate. The State Department has made it very clear. P.J. Crowley, the spokesman, said it very explicitly. They did not reach out to Columbia. They did not advise Columbia to issue that policy. And in fact, they described Columbia's policy as an overreaction. So somebody who was in the State Department, official, somebody who works at State Department, the story is an alum called and said, this is what you've got to do. It was not an official State Department to Columbia. This is the policy you should have, and the State Department has disavowed the Columbia policy.
But to get to your point, and it goes to some of the other questions, the first issue for this task force has got to be to stop the rest of this material from coming out as best as possible. And you can't, the horse is out of the barn with respect to the 1,500 messages that are already out there. And I think once the State Department can stem the flow, then there should be a discussion of whether or not, since the material is already out, that some magical wand is waved, the stuff is now declassified, and academics here can treat it as they do any material. But again, I think all attention is now being focused, A, on stopping the leakage, and number two, on containing the immediate damage in specific bilateral relationships or regional contexts. And I'm not sure that these larger debates are as yet part of what's going on.
Oh, okay. Next. No. Well, the State Department already had the documents. So the State Department didn't need WikiLeaks to get a hold of. I mean, not only did a private, sitting out in Baghdad have access to all of our cables, so did we. So no, it would not be a source for the State Department, if I'm understanding your question.
And that sort of, I didn't mean to say something, like other political relations with Iran and Turkey,
We're already seeing that various countries are using some material that's out there for their own purposes.
Right.
In the Middle East, some governments are saying that their policies vis-a-vis Iran, Israel, for example, has argued that its policies vis-a-vis Iran are now justified by the early reports that suggest that the Arab world is as concerned as Iran as they are. It may be premature to make that judgment, but that's an initial judgment that's being made. And you'll see that elsewhere as well. I don't think it applies to our own government. I'm not suggesting we own the material, but we're seeing it now. Part of our diplomacy is going to be dealing with countries that use WikiLeaks to either justify what they're doing or ex post facto to say that they were right all along, even though we may have disagreed with them.
Yeah, and this kind of gets back to this, the debate about, what is the value of academics and others reading the entire cables? And I have not read WikiLeaks, and I don't intend to. But according to somebody who did read one.
Speak into the microphone.
Yes, I did
No, I'll
not
just write it down.
read it. I understand the rules. That somebody who did read the cut off the head of the snake cable said that if you read the entire cable, it makes it clear that King Abdullah is not supporting a military strike against Iran. And this is where I was saying that, we are at this point dependent on what the New York Times chooses to pull out and tell us was in the cable. And that does give me pause. It's that not only are the cables out of context, but the journalistic reporting on them takes sentences out of context, which then can be used by governments, friend and foe, to justify an action or something like that. And so that's where there is an intellectual quandary, even if there isn't really a moral or ethical quandary.
Quite simply, you may not like the American government deciding its foreign policy for you, but you might like less some reporter from the New York Times deciding it.
I have to admit, there's part of me that would love to see all of my reporting out. I'll tell you why. Because as my colleagues did, I spent hours and hours with heads of state and foreign ministers, and I think that the reporting that we did and the analysis that we did and the recommendations that we did would stand up well. Not that everybody would agree with them. Washington certainly didn't most of the time. So there's a part of me that says, it would actually be interesting for people who don't have access to what we do all the time to see that we do what we think is right. On the other hand, God forbid that all my reporting should get out, because these were conversations based on confidences with heads of state and with foreign ministers, and the recommendations that I made were blunt enough that it was nobody else's business but the Secretary of State or the President or whoever else was reading it. So, it's not that I don't want the three of us to come across as kind of monolithic, let's go after them, kind of things. There's a part of us that's very proud of what we've seen, if we haven't looked at the cables. Because our diplomats are doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. It's just that the system has now really been impacted, and that's really dangerous.
Yeah. The cost was high. Andrew?
Ambassador Kurtzer, could you elaborate on the ethical distinction from the perspective of news organizations between something like WikiLeaks, this aimless, nihilistic attack on diplomacy overall, and what you referred to as a sort of pointed, policy-oriented leak? Going back to the open vault analogy, it seems to be what you seem to be saying is that it's wrong to walk into an open vault and just take whatever you want just because the vault is already open, but it's okay if the bank is a bad one.
No, we can pursue this.
It's the trouble with analogies.
Yeah, it's not so much that the bank is a bad one. Is it okay if all you take are the proceeds of crimes or of other illegal activities? In other words, the vault has a lot of good things in it, and it's got maybe some drug money. What if you passed by and said, I'm only taking the drug money because it shouldn't be there protected? And, we could have a great, and I'm sure there are moral theorists in this university who could have a wonderful time with this argument better than I. And that's kind of as far as I take it. I don't, as I said, I don't know the answer to the question. but it's at least worth asking that question if the motivation here had been directed at a major policy debate and the crime was focused on uncovering material related to that policy debate. So even if I walk into that vault and I scarf up all of the money, but if I'm only focused on the drug money, the next day I should give back 95% of it, because that's not of concern to me. What happened here is he scarfed up all of the money and then went around the streets dispensing it and dispersing it.
And I think, maybe, analogies are always dangerous because you take them to the next step and they fall apart. But I think, whistleblowers, in private corporations or even in government, but whistleblowers, there's a difference between a whistleblower who is going after a particular policy or a particular executive who they know is corrupt and somebody who just goes and basically destroys the entire company. And the fact that they take down the corrupt company official at the same time is, in a sense, just, collateral damage to what they were trying to do. So I would put it, that would be the distinction between a whistleblower and it's basically somebody who just brings down a company just to bring it down without any thought to what else that company does in the long-term impact.
To make another simpler analogy, if we consider what's going on as a doctor's office, if someone went in and took all the files from a doctor and published them in the New York Times, God knows no one would want to read them, but we'd find misdiagnoses and mistakes that were made where the doctor might be legally culpable, but everyone agreed that that should not have been there in the first place because it's none of our business. And this is, on the national scale, what's going on.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Looking ahead, would it be possible to afford more protection to foreign sources who talk freely and frankly to our diplomats by assigning code names to some of them and limiting the distribution appropriately of the key to those codes? It would seem to me that it may be from the context that the person is readily identified. That's surely a problem. But it may be the case also that a number of people who are helpful sources could be protected by a device of that kind, assuming, of course, that the key to the code was transmitted to the higher level of classification.
Yeah, that's the problem. First of all, you point out one problem with using code names, which is, well, first of all, everyone needs to know the code. So you have to, how do you protect the code? Second, from context, having read, there are some elements of the government who do their cables that way, and it's pretty obvious who they're talking about. So it's not a very good cover. But Dan mentioned one likely effect of this is there are higher classifications already, and at least what I have seen is that they did not get anything above secret, and there is a world above secret. There are also ways of limiting distribution, all sorts of different things. And what I would expect will happen is not only will things go into telephones, which I think is very, very dangerous, but some of these more sensitive conversations already are in these more limited distributions and higher classifications. And what will happen is that some of them, more will go up there.
I mean, the really good stuff, the times when I wanted something really to be read by very few people, I would call the executive secretariat at the State Department and say, you're going to get a message in the next hour, and my recommendation is it goes to these 5 people. And we might have a discussion, maybe somebody else needs to know, but at the end of the day, it could be limited very, very carefully. And you couldn't do that on everything you sent in, but it also tells you what you're not going to see out of WikiLeaks, that good stuff.
The other problem is, I think you're getting at stopping the leak at this end, and I want to go back to one of the early questions, which is there is a problem at the distribution of too many cables are going to too many people who do not have a need to know. and they are not being properly supervised in a way that, they don't have the time and the access to download 250,000 cables. So, while you're working on the system, let's walk this thing back to how did this happen in the first place, and what can you reasonably do to limit distribution so that a private sitting in Baghdad doesn't have that access, which he doesn't need, and still retain distribution to those who do need it. Is the information, if it's not shared, is of no value.
I think we're going to take one more question from the student, and then we'll.
Yes.
I guess I'm speaking, following up on my question, speaking for those who plan to go into government service, wondering about the pushback in the other direction. In the sense of entering into these situations where we have to learn protocols regarding classification and need-to-know bases, and wondered whether or not they'll be pushed too far in overreaction to WikiLeaks. And I'm wondering if you have some of your opinions on that.
If I were to guess, I think you are going to be the first class to be in the pushback mode, because there will be more emphasis now in, if you're going to the State Department, in what's called the A100 class on security of information. There will be new systems put in place. There may be codes put into place with respect to reporting. I think it's going to be, in other words, I think the three of us can tell you what happened as of the day before yesterday. But I think you're going to be facing a new system, because as they stem the tide of these leaks, they're going to have to develop remedies, both technological and human, to try to prevent it in the future.
And will that create a problem for the quality of reporting and diplomacy for junior diplomats?
No. The purpose of the new procedures is going to be, the theory will be, to allow you to still do your job, rather than, if they don't do anything to change procedures, regulations, and how you handle classified information, then your ability to do your job would be compromised by this chilling. So in a sense, they're going to be trying to get the credibility back into the system so that you can do your job.
Yeah, I think what you've been saying all along, Barbara, is the important thing, is the distribution and the access in the first place. And that has not been actually in the State Department a problem. People are compartmentalized. They can't just access everything. So they need to bring back some of those controls. There might be some loss. These things are all organic, so there will be, they're going to be very strict, and then over time they'll figure out where they can make it a little bit easier. But the goal will be to continue to do our job, which people have been, we think, doing pretty well.
As I said, if anyone wants to read what the law is and the regulations are in that, in a very straightforward, unbelievably legalistic, jargonistic manner, I have it right here, just so you can read it yourself and see what it says.
Well, I think we'll all agree that was an amazing program, and I certainly learned a lot. So thank you very much.